Okay, sorry about that. And thank you all for joining us. My name is Patrick, and I'm one of the editors of Cesura and one of the curators of this show, along with my friend David Faze from NetArt to Post Internet. We've got this panel today, sort of reflecting on some of the theoretical stakes of digital media and internet art, and sort of trying to think about it in a way that is, we think a little bit different than sort of terms that become common with NFTs, things like that. I don't know if David, you might want to say something about the panel and
Yeah, I think that it might be helpful to just share with the audience some of the questions that we asked the panelists to reflect on. So, most artists today use digital technology at some point in the creation of their work. But what would it mean for art to confront the question of what it means to think, see, and feel through the digital? How does the digital uniquely shape our aesthetic imagination? Where do passive mediums such as photography, film, and video stand in relation to the digital? Do digital media simply repose older questions regarding technological reproduction of art? Or are new aesthetic possibilities in fact supposed? Digital images are often presented in aggregations which are frequently presented in a manner which is too vast to appreciate as a single object. For instance, if one were to Google search sunsets, how have artists recontextualized the accumulation of images in order to create an aesthetic? Has the paradigm of the aesthetic object been challenged by internet art? Can communication between users, between clients and servers, become the subject of an aesthetic? How does a work premised on a dialogic relationship between the work of art and the viewer, seeking a real-world impact, assume the form of an object to be recognized as a work of art? In what ways has digital art inherited such questions from social practice art? In what ways does digital art pose new challenges? Digital media at a technical level are lexical. If you convert an image file to text, it would be illegible to the human mind and eye. Algorithms are used to systematically switch small lights on and off to create the illusion of an image. Color, light, and texture of images, sounds, and words become predominant. How can we understand the relationship between the machine linguistic basis of the medium and its material aesthetic qualities?
So we asked the panelists to respond to these, and then we'll have a little chance for them to respond to one another in a Q&A. And I think we're just going to go from left to right. So to introduce our speakers, we have Kerry Doran, who is a PhD candidate in the Art History Department at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and a curatorial advisor at M+ Museum of Visual Culture in Hong Kong. We have Christiane, who is a professor in the School of Media Studies at the New School, as well as curator of digital art at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And then we have Elle, Burchill, and Andrea Monti, who are artists, curators, and co-founder directors of Microscope Gallery, which presents work by emerging to pioneering artists, working in all mediums with an emphasis on moving image, sound, performance, and digital art. All right, so I think with that, Kerry, if you can get started.
A little bit of a stretch. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you everybody for coming. I just want to ask a question to you first. Should I respond with to these questions, or sort of what I have prepared to?
You can respond to what you prepared.
Okay, great. So, as a PhD student, I'm sort of working on things and thinking through things, and I have a few articles that are, in the mix but not yet published. So some of these thoughts are a little bit in development and maybe seemingly tangential, but I hope they come across as an appropriate response to the show. So new media are always getting older, and the difficulty as well as the excitement of working within this field is in the naming of this category. That is always changing, technologically and socially. I believe I learned this actually from Christiane, Digital Art, one of the most formative books in the subject of digital art, and I think in its third edition now.
Fourth is coming out.
Fourth, okay. So along with that, new media are also not so new. They extend from other older technologies, but their organizing principles also originate from quote-unquote real-world conditions, like racialized, colonized, and gendered forms of oppression that interlock with the capitalist mode of production of which the internet is a part. And by saying, real world, I'm not necessarily saying that the internet isn't real. Of course, virtual experiences are legitimate and felt, but also, it's an internet complex, as Jonathan Kerry has recently described it, and this necessitates bodies and resources and labor and physical infrastructures. So Kerry was somebody that I was thinking about in relationship to this topic because he's a good example of a historian who contextualizes the internet complex in a longer historical trajectory, beginning in the early 19th century with the formation of the viewing subject, or the separation of the human body from the viewing eye. More often than not, though, digital art histories are more circumscribed to the 20th century, though they often reference 19th century computational innovations, such as punch cards of Charles Babbage and Augusta Ada King. However, briefly returning to Kerry, the shortcoming of his otherwise astute purpose is its Eurocentric foundation, which does not acknowledge that global capitalism in fact began with the colonization of the Americas and African, indigenous, and Asian enslavement and genocide. Part of my broader research is to historicize the emergence of so-called internet art through this history. Therefore, my project also entails a rethinking of terms, which I think is very much part of the conversation tonight. For example, what does the internet even mean or refer to? And how about virtuality? Or the digital. Many colloquial words used to describe the internet and its culture are loaded with the colonial and imperialist histories from which they spring forth. Brave New World, for example, is the New World, sort of as a software update. Or we often use the word avatar. This connotes the graphical representation of the computer user, which is also quite dehumanizing. But in fact, avatar is appropriative, techno-orientalist, and neo-colonial. Or how about the digital frontier? We hear this a lot with NFT conversations right now. Or how are Grind built virtual homesteading? These are terms of settler colonialism. After saying this, I probably shouldn't have to say why digital native is a problematic term. But to return to the fact of history momentarily. The press release makes the claim, and it makes sense that they do, because most histories of internet art say this, that internet developed from Cold War research in the US Department of Defense's ARPANET, the first wide-area packet switch network established in 1969. This is true. However, I'm interested in looking at another, even darker side of this militaristic, imperialist history, namely what labor and resources were extracted to make this project possible. For some background on my own work, I focus my studies in the Global South because of very specific political, economic, theoretical, and cultural histories. Where do we think all the copper has come from the circuit boards, high-speed cables, and internet connections? Where was the playground for the testing of neoliberal policies before they were implemented in the so-called West? The neoliberalization, which is so often described as being made manifest with the internet. Chile is probably the most obvious answer for both, but the answer is many other questions in Central and South America for whom we could ask. Chile is the most obvious answer for both, but there are many other countries in Central and South America for whom we could ask similar questions. theoretically speaking, I'm drawing these ideas from decolonial theory. This emerged from anti-colonial struggles in the 1950s and 60s, but articulates as a school of thought out of Latin America with thinkers such as Aníbal Quijano and Walter Mignolo. So finally, I haven't really said much about culture, which is sort of what we're dealing with in this space, and art is just one part of that. But if considering everything I've just said, we shift the historical and conceptual terms of the conversation, what does internet mean, and what does internet art mean, and what does it look like? So what have I just described? This is sort of a very cursory description of what Mignolo describes as delinking. And delinking as a decolonial methodology means to change the terms and not just the content of the conversation, to write against the coloniality of the modernist project, and recentering non-Western epistemologies to advocate for a polycentric world. Thus, as I understand the new and exciting possibility of internet art right now, is a rethinking of the field. As this exhibition proposes, the term internet art is already a slippery one, considering how much internet culture has suffused contemporary reality. Is it really that helpful of a term? To think of this another way, if I say I found something on the internet, does that tell you anything specific? The internet extends from the world. It's as large as the world. So saying I found something on the internet is basically like saying you found something in the world. When we rethink the terms and not just the content of the conversation, the field becomes simultaneously more capacious and more specific. As one model of this thinking, I'm always inspired by Black feminist and media scholar Anna Everett, and she was the first to theorize the digital diaspora, noting how virtual communities and intercultural kinship were necessities that emerged out of the horrors of the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade. So for me, working on the Global South, I work in solidarity with such scholarship. I'm interested in thinking about how the internet is or can be decentralized, which we're seeing with NFTs right now, and how decentralization might look like as a methodology, locating different sites in a polycentric history. Furthermore, my subjectivity, politics, and approach to art history are queer. I'm thinking about nonlinear time and queer time/history that remaps space and geography. So many of the BIPOC and LGBTQIA cultural practitioners with whom I collaborate make work that may not always look like quote-unquote internet art. But many times they are augmenting web-based works or those made with digital technologies. And oftentimes these are quite intimate and community-centered offline encounters that entail or foreground embodiment. What unifies these very diverse practices is their critiques of the racial and cis-heteropatriarchal matrix from which the internet complex extends, and their cultivation of queer ways of being and knowing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the excellent introduction and decolonizing the field, which I think was a nice setup. And thanks everyone for coming. So I'm going to take a little bit more of a historical look at the evolution of the medium and start with definitions. First of all, I would say that digital art, as commonly understood, is art that makes use of its medium and of the digital and reflects on it. So it is not art that uses digital technologies as a tool. If you walk into any gallery today, most of the work, in fact, may have used digital technologies at some point in its creation. And the fact that a photograph is a digital print does not necessarily make it digital art. So that kind of reflection on the medium and making use of the qualities of the medium, I think, is what defines the digital. And we have, to some extent, seen digital art come full circle when it comes to materiality. and its engagement with materiality. So here in the exhibition right behind you, for example, you have a work by Vera Molnar, one of the pioneers of digital art, who together with the other so-called algorists such as Frida Nake, Georg Nies, Manfred Mohr, Chuck Chury, and many others, started exploring generative algorithmic drawing. And one of the reasons for that also simply was that at the time they were creating their work, they were not able to render to the screen. That technologically would have been a challenge. And what is important to the work which presents itself as drawing is that it really explores the generative qualities of the digital medium, setting in motion a process. And very often, if you look at sequences of their works, for example, Mohr's explorations of hypercubes, you can really see how generativity plays out in the digital medium. Of course, in the early days, we also have seen a lot of other types of work, early robotic works by Ignatovic, for example. It's fantastic, the Sensor. John Whitney creating with Catalog, really the beginnings of graphic design and digital film. So a lot of experimentation in that era. In the 70s, we also see engagement with interactivity of laser discs, for example. I'm thinking of Lynn Hirschman, Leeson's Lorna, for example, one of the classics in which you navigate work that is shown on a monitor through a remote control and navigate the story of this woman, Lorna, trapped on the screen. So classic of that time. And then in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, we also see a lot of generative software art, of installation art, game art, engagement with virtual spaces and VR. So really a broadening of the landscape of practice. And then, of course, a game changer was definitely net art and the World Wide Web coming about. First of all, one needs to say that the internet, of course, was launched in the 1960s, and there has been art pre the web, but what we consider net art today started on the web. And to some of Kerry's points, I think we also have to look at the social environments and communities and groups practicing at the time. So there was a net art community in Europe, including practitioners such as Olya Lialina, often called the mother of net art, and Joby, Entropy 8 Super, and many others who were in dialogue, while in the US it was people like Mark Napier and Maciej Wisniewski and Martin Wattenberg who really carried on the dialogue. And on the one hand, there was a challenging of the aesthetic object and of museum structures in general. On the other hand, and I'll get to that in a little bit more depth later, there is, of course, that connection to conceptual art that Frida Nake in particular also pointed out early on, referring to Solowit and the idea as the machine that makes the art. And Nake would say, well, we literally did that through our algorithmic and programmatic art. And later, software artists such as Casey Rias would very much build on that. What we then see in the early 2000s is really a movement from the original net art to a more problematic understanding that your remarks very much got to what is the internet, what is that space, and to the idea of networked art, so artists starting to work across media. And I think that really became very pronounced in what is often referred to as the post-digital. And the post-digital is one of those very blurry terms, post-digital or post-internet. And I think there are various ways of understanding it. One more general way is artists who are really taking the vernacular of the web and of the internet for granted and are playing with that. And pretty much what surrounds you here is a good example of that. There were artists in the 90s who used animated GIFs for their work, but Lorna Mills is really pushing that to a completely new level, I would say, more in a post-internet aesthetic of understanding that vernacular and relying on you understanding it from the start and pushing it into abstracted forms in a different kind of dialogue. You know, as does John Rathman or Rosa Mengman in continuing the early glitch art of Dan Sandin and other pioneers of video art. So part of the post-digital is that taking of the vernacular as granted, but I think post-internet and post-digital also signified a shift to materiality, as you see in works by Arnie Birkan, for example, or Raphael Rosendahl, where the work would not be possible without network technologies or digital technologies, but it ultimately takes physical form and it becomes an object. So here I think we have a return to materiality that has been happening in digital art. I want to come back briefly to this idea of, as you called it, the lexicon. And I would also say conceptual in terms of relying on language. So artists who are creating software art, such as Casey Reers, for example, always were very clear about the fact that they are using mathematical language to describe a work that then becomes visual and produces some kind of art. And that to me makes digital art very unique. If you are a painter or a photographer, there's a different relationship to the medium. If you see a painting, you can still see the brush stroke, but here you have really text and mathematical language generating the work, and that vanishes behind it unless you're conceptually foregrounding it. And in 2002, I actually curated an exhibition called Code Doc, in which I investigated that and let the artist exhibit the code first, in order to explore that type of materiality, which I think is really unique. So in closing, a few more connections I would like to draw to digital futures and the areas that have seen a lot of interest recently and are often in the third wave. For example, VR art. So we're looking at the third wave of VR. I think it's gaining more and more momentum also with social spaces, with the problematic term of the metaverse and the return to the virtuality in that respect and to virtual worlds. We have, of course, seen an explosion of AI art in recent years, yet another area, although Harold Cohen, of course, in the late 1960s and early 70s created the first AI drawing software, Aaron, which has been drawing ever since. Harold would joke that he would be the only artist making work posthumously. Then another space is the much hyped NFT landscape, and I could talk for hours about that. But just in a nutshell, of course, tokens and pre-NFTs were already conceptualized by artists as early as 2014, when Kevin McCoy and the New Dash at the New Museum presented monographs, really thought of as a certificate of authenticity with built-in royalties for artists, an idea of supporting artists. And as early as 2017, Furtherfield published a book, Artists Rethinking the Blockchain, and you really saw an engagement of artists with the blockchain as a medium. Along came NFTs and suddenly an understanding of digital art as hanging JPEGs on the blockchain, and confusion of an art medium with a sales mechanism. And my hope is that we're returning more to that exploration of the token and of the blockchain as a medium, as some artists are already doing, and with the recent crashes in the crypto space, I think we're also seeing more of a return to substance and rethinking what really can be done in a generative way on the blockchain. And of course, there are so many other aspects, from environmental issues to equity and inclusion and other things that you have touched upon that need to be considered in that space and in material. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, this is going to be a little unusual because the two of us, since we curate together, are going to try to talk together. So it might not be as smooth as some of the previous presentations. And as well, we're coming from slightly different viewpoints, not viewpoints, but positions, let's say, in that we are artists and we're also curators and people who present these works in the context of other mediums. So we were asked to talk a little bit more about connections, that a lot of what you see, which isn't, you know, you can debate that, tends often not to be on screen, or and whether there's any kind of historical placing of digital art within, say, moving image, or performance, or other type of time-based arts. So we think so, that's why we originally included it. We know that a lot of people who practice, who are digital artists, often work with other technological forms before these technologies became available. There are people who didn't, they came straight from other places, but there is a realm, and I'm not talking about someone shoots a video, that's not what I'm talking about, but within the context of, digital. But when it comes to aesthetics, we just start with the main technology is basically photographic, and then it leads to film, which is all photographs anyway, just moving. There's a certain textures and identifiable aesthetics that exist within film, and it's less, it's higher quality. Film is taking forever for digital, not it's taking a very long time for imagery and digital to be able to reproduce what that image looked like in film. So it's a totally different aesthetic. In between was video, which came with the advent of, which became broadcast TV originally, and it ends up in 65, Sony ends up in the hands of artists pretty quickly, and there was no ability to really get it all. It was connected to a monitor. There were not. Well, anyway, so that's where we were with that, and then people start already working, trying to use some of the computer technology. I think you were going to talk about this. With they can't output it, so they shoot film of the imagery generated. And then, sorry, I'm having a nervous breakdown. Sometimes I can't do public speaking. Maybe you should do.
Yeah, I can see.
I lost my notes.
Yeah, so I guess you could say that digital is just a part of moving image, and moving image is just a part of digital. Digital is just the very inner structure of the support or medium of moving image. And that happened around the 1990s. So up until then, moving image still found a way to somehow intersect with digital and computers. Like, of course, you have the digital abstractions of John Whitney and Mary Ellen Butte too, and using electronics. But that wasn't quite yet digital until I think we come to Ken Norton and the Bell Labs in the mid-60s, and where, with his help, of course, Stan Van der Beek and also Lillian Schwartz started shooting films off of essentially these computer screens. making beautiful graphics, abstraction, animations. Then we had a switch to analog video in the 60s, 65, as I said. The first camera became available, and that was a huge difference in the moving image world, as video offers so many more different possibilities, such as instant playback or the ability to leave the camera running for a long period of time. Live stream. And around that time, of course, also artists started engaging more with video in the form of, at that point, projection wasn't yet very deadlocked, so they used mostly TV screens, so we have a lot of TV installations, early video pioneers such as Bazilkas and Frank Gillette and Ira Schneider's Wipe Cycle and works of that type. And then later, we get finally in the 90s to digital. I think the first camera was introduced in 1993, an MPEG camera, and at that point you could say maybe that finally moving image formats and computers spoke the same language, in the sense that for the first time you could actually hook up your camera and transfer your video to a computer and be able to work on that, and also it was much easier to copy and distribute.
I don't want to get too much into the realm of visualizing moving image. The issue was talking about how these influenced people who ended up working in digital art. And so, right, just some basic things that people might not think about, because we know that there's people who, we weren't sure who the audience would actually be, but there are people who weren't alive when film was prominent. They don't even know what film looks like. They don't know today film and digital is considered, people use it as if film is digital. So the ability to, like a film is a film script, right, that runs through projected light. Digital tape was the mechanism of video that was the analog video. And so then it became more accessible to people. There were lots of groups that developed that were able to hand out cameras around to communities, and a lot of different types of artwork was made during that time as it was cheaper. There was also durational aspects that were expanded. There were a lot of things that happened. And then once you get to the digital, at first it's a block. You know, you have to own a computer, and you have to have internet access. And lots of people still today don't have internet access. You know? Yeah. But the art of people who were moving into that, like QuickTime started in 1991, right? So at that time, people weren't able to really make their own. There wasn't even the ability, as far as I can remember, to hook up a camera to digital. You had to. People were transferring analog video to digital, and but in every time you get a new interface, and every time you get a new camera, and every time you get a new mechanism to show it, it's all connected. The aesthetics become connected to the tools and of how you make the art and how it's shown. So colors change based on, there's the art that develops with 8-bit. There's the art, like today we have 16K. And I'm not talking about people who are shooting film or films. I'm talking about artists who are exploring the realms within it, and it's constantly changing. Digital aesthetic, as we were asked to speak about, is always new, depending on what the new medium is, which everyone knows this, but it's constantly changing. So if you want to talk about it as digital aesthetic, we were trying to think of what are the things that are actually consistent. Well, of course, the pixel. There's always the pixel, although in vector graphics, it's not really as close. But there is glitch, of course, the eruptions that, unlike tape, which is a degradation of film which gets scratched. What are the ground points? What is digital, what is digital specific? It was kind of challenging, you know. Maybe you can just rattle off all the things, but you know, I don't think you can do that, because every time you get another medium, you get another potential for disruption or when things that come up. That's what's so exciting about it. So people think you can identify digital art. I'm not so sure. You know, you can see sculptures put on 3D. Not necessarily, you don't necessarily know that. And it's getting ever, I mean, why? Why does everyone want to just reproduce the best high quality possible thing in the world? I'm not sure. But that seems to be, you know, we're going to be creating virtual reality to mirror exactly our reality. And then, I don't know, where do we live? Sorry. I think we have nothing else to say.
Thank you all. Maybe we could go into maybe a round of responses to one another. If they maybe have some thoughts about the opening remarks that they can give some guidance. I mean, one thing that I was sort of thinking about as coming up was being this distinction between the internet and digital media as a kind of social and cultural phenomenon, as something that you know has come into existence in the world over the past century. We're sort of taking long view of things. And then there's like how artists have tried to work with that technology and have tried to reflect on it aesthetically in the work. And so we've talked, I think, especially about these sort of some of the cultural, social, and historical sort of preconditions for internet art. But I guess I'm still feeling like in terms of what the aesthetic possibilities, the potential within the work, within the medium, and how artists have sort of tried to express that or exploit that. So it might be good to talk a little bit more about taking it.
Sure. I thought another theme in all of the speakers' remarks was the relationship, the distinction between the challenge that new media present to established aesthetic traditions, and also the kind of gravitational center of these works around the history of conceptual art, abstract art, and really the history of the modern avant-garde going back to the 19th century. And so, I mean, in a way, it's an extension of Patrick's question, trying to pinpoint where are the aesthetic innovations occurring and how are they being captured in the artwork.
I think maybe to sort of put it bluntly, I think the question is sort of why would artists be interested in the internet and in digital media, and why would they want to work within that space?
Well, just broadening that a little bit and coming back to your initial question, you could say that there always is a social, cultural, and aesthetic space for media. Photography and, as you so nicely outlined, film, video, and the internet and the digital are all operating in spaces of media that have been used for multiple purposes. I mean, photography had the challenge of why is it art and not a purely journalistic representational medium? Video art, why or how is this not television? Or how does digital art distinguish itself from the other uses of digital technologies? And I think what attracted artists to all of these spaces definitely is the unique ability to comment on their impact on their aesthetic language and make us aware of it. And in that sense, I would also suggest they have been pushing photography or television or video or digital technologies to new spaces. So I think that interest is always there, and it goes beyond the digital, but extends to other media. And then you mentioned aesthetics, and I think at the very core, what makes the digital aesthetic digital is computability. And then you can add on layers, the real-time, generative, participatory aspects of it that do not always have to surface. And just as a response in general, I really like that you told the history of the digital more from the film video perspective. And I think what's very important to keep in mind is that the history of the digital is kind of bifurcated. And there's one strand that very strongly builds on the film video history, and even on those pre-cinematic devices, the zoetrope. I mean, look at the loop, and all of those devices are directly related to it. And then that of conceptual generative art, and generative art is also pre-digital, of course. The Jacquard loom is often mentioned as the beginning of computing, but you can take it back to Islamic tile art and other aspects that mathematically generated something. So I think keeping those two histories in mind is very important.
I would say that we'd say something about performance. Performance is a realm that exists, especially people like Anne Hirsch and Angela Washko, and people working within games, like Angela, she infiltrated male-dominated gaming culture and would get in there and started asking feminist questions in live situations. And then Anne Hirsch early work where she was a cam girl, but it was before cam girls, until it was basically, but out of her living room while she was in high school. And then she ended up getting on a reality TV show based on that, because I didn't know it was a really strange thing that you should know she was an artist, and she was in there as an infiltrator of this reality TV show. But there's other people using that digital art as performances. There, it extends into the virtual reality realm. The AR realm, VR realm. I just think that performance elements shouldn't be left out of digital art, even though it feels so technical. There is an element of human in a lot of the works, aside from community interaction and speaking. There's also performance.
Yeah, and I also think that's super important. Performativity was so important to net art in particular. I would also say that, there definitely is still a strong performative element in digital art today, but I think the 90s and early net art in particular were really the heyday of that performativity, and a very different relationship than the post-digital engagement.
I guess I'm sort of confused of the question. Is it that we're wondering if there's like a unified aesthetic of the internet? No? I guess I don't understand the question.
Yeah, let me think if I can repose it. It's not necessarily that there's a unified aesthetic, but it does seem to me that there's something unique to the motivation behind digital internet art that's sort of distinct from other kinds of art media. Something that I was thinking of just now is that with photography, film, and then video and digital media, you have artists sort of working for the first time with technology that has a kind of use outside of art. So with painting and sculpture, the sort of traditional media of oil painting and marble sculpture or clay or whatever, the utility is sort of particular to like the artistic object, the artwork. Well, yeah. Well, something like painting specifically, like oil painting or like marble sculpture, that kind of there's something to that kind of medium, that doesn't have doesn't have the same kind of use, I guess, that photography or film so clearly have. And to me, it seems that like with this kind of with this art, you have a sort of technology learning first, and then the art is sort of taking it up. And so I guess I'm sort of trying to ask about like that dynamic. What is the relationship between artists and technology, and how they use it, and how is that different from the technology itself, I guess?
Okay, thank you for clarifying. I don't know if I fully subscribe to this sort of like historical trajectory, because most of the things that we know as like quote unquote art objects were not made as art objects. This is really established with like the history of Western easel painting, and even these things were like, not in art galleries, for example. Most of the objects that we see in museums are sacred objects that have been stolen from people. But with the internet in particular, I think that very much like previous forms of technology-based art, there's always sort of an impulse for artists who work with that so-called medium to sort of carve out their space in that field. With photography and film, I think that both of actually 3 of our speakers have already commented on that point of sort of the necessity or the drive for artists to sort of differentiate their practice from maybe the more everyday usage of these things. I guess with the internet, for me though, I think what's exciting about it is that it's not so much about the technology. I think that kind of gets too focused on actually. Even with these conversations about sort of and sorry, I'm not like dissing generative art and software-based art. I work with all these kinds of artists and have represented them in the past, etc. I guess what I'm trying to say is like the focus on the technology sort of overemphasizes like the formalism of these things. And I think that what's exciting about internet art is that it can be formal, and there are some people who are like very self-described like internet artists, like somebody that Christiane mentioned, Leolina. She, during the post-internet moment, was like, I'm not a post-internet artist. Like I make web-based works. I'm an internet artist. But I think so much of maybe like the younger generation of artists. There are sort of these different strains of some folks who were like, well, I just want to be seen as an artist. I don't want to be seen as like an internet artist, because the internet is everywhere. Everybody's using digital technologies, et cetera, et cetera. But then there's other people who work in like a much more vernacular and sort of everyday way. And I think that Lorna Mills is like a perfect example of that. And I love the way that Christiane framed this of sort of like the encounter with that work as somebody who kind of already has this base familiarity with sort of GIF, symbol resolution images and things like that. And there's plenty of people who are working online who, are not going to be showing their work in a gallery in this context, but are making things just as brilliant as Lorna. And there's sort of this differentiation between, what is capital A art and what's not. And I think maybe this is like a segue to NFTs if we want to go down that road, but it's like that's one of the great things that's been happening within the NFT space is like so many people who would not necessarily have been or haven't been shown in a traditional gallery context or haven't had access to the gallery world. Maybe their aesthetic hasn't been like capital A art for some people. They're finding collectors, and even if they're not finding collectors, they're finding community, and they're buying each other's work, they're supporting one another's work.
Because if we really get down to it, what art is, capital A art, is like a very elitist value judgment of like what we consider to be good and valuable, but like what somebody else considers to be good and valuable is just fine too. Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, I agree the internet or that environment is of course not a unified space, and it's just also interesting to look at how artists' attitude towards it has, I think, substantially changed over the decades. So the early net artists were really about avoiding the institution, blending with the network, and the idea that they became indistinguishable from their context to some extent, or that they were embedded in a different context and just one click away from your banking transactions or whatever it was. That was the point. And that also fundamentally changed, as you indicated. Then also came a phase where they were saying, look, I make art, why am I not? It's all fine that I'm using that environment and I love it and I love that context, but at the same time I also want to be seen with those A-list painters or whatever. So I think that changed a lot. In the 90s, you were never sure if artists would say, sure, I'd love to be in your show, or early 2000s at the Whitney, or said, no, I would never want to be in a museum. I think that fundamentally changed. Today you do not necessarily get that attitude anymore. And I'm not sure if the high art, low art discussion is a problematic one. I would say, all creative expression is fantastic, and people should support whatever they like and whatever they see. I also must, so for example, Norman Rockwell, great painter, doesn't have to be in the Whitney Museum. I don't think so. That's maybe not that context. And that is true for a lot of the NFT art. All power to the artists, and I think people should buy it and support it. But is it, and how is it in dialogue with other forms? And to me, that is, I absolutely agree with you that the art world is, of course, elitist in so many ways, but I think it's also great to just bring it down to the question of aesthetics and what is a dialogue, and talk about that.
I mean, when it comes to NFTs, there's not a whole lot of I mean, it's like you said, it's a certificate. So it's connected to some kind of art, but it can be any kind of art that it's connected to. It doesn't have to be what we seem to see mostly, just a digital photograph, not a digital photograph, but a digital image, or a yes, right? Yeah, or slide video, things like that. So I'm not really sure about NFTs.
I have to say, so I do not want to, in 2014 I was blown away. I thought this is just so fantastic and so amazing. Many of the JPEGs I see floating today are not, but there is enormous potential for great art. Just to mention a few pieces, I love Jonas Rann's most valuable painting, for example, 500 plus NFTs. And as soon as one is minted, a fitness algorithm and likes determine how all of the others are evolving. So it's also a critical stance on tastes and likes and how that space works until the final one then is the supposedly quote-unquote most valuable. And that's a highly involved generative work that comments on the market and that space. And also just, I don't want to focus on Jonas per se, there are many other artists, but he has done basically a tokenized art practice where I'm part of a group of token holders, and together we are determining to some extent, we're evaluating his proposals and are determining how work is installed in upcoming exhibitions and how to do that. And an artist handing over that authority and tokenizing that's an interesting game to play to comment on art world structures. So I think all of that is great, and there's a lot of potential, and I hope we're going to see more of that and stuff that is done environmentally more sustainable.
Well, I think now might be a good time to sort of open up some questions to the audience. So